Good morning and welcome to the third day of our 35th annual EMI SIG meeting. It's my pleasure this morning to begin the day with the after action process presented by Jim Paulson. I personally found this extremely interesting, being so new to emergency management myself. This cleared up a lot of questions, and I know you're going to find it very engaging. Just a few words about Jim. He has focused on developing, implementing, and executing emergency management since 1996. He joined Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in emergency management in December 2019. He participated in Lawrence Livermore's response to COVID-19, where he was responsible for the after-action review. Prior to Lawrence Livermore, Mr. Paulson worked with over 200 governmental agencies and large corporations to understand and implement their emergency management methodology and technology. Please remember to enter your questions in the chat tool. There's a small lag between this presentation and what you're seeing on Attendify, so don't hesitate to get those in there so we can get right into the Q&A. And now it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Jim Paulson. The virtual stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you. The objective of emergency management during an emergency is to reduce the loss of life, the impact to infrastructure, and the disruption of operations. These are fairly important objectives, and it's critical that we as emergency managers learn from each drill, exercise, and real emergency. The primary tool that we have for learning from these is the after-action review. This presentation is going to provide a comprehensive approach to conducting the after-action review process. First, a little background on the after-action review. It was created by the Department of Defense to address issues that came up during the Vietnam War. It was vetted and tested at the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California during the 70s, and ultimately deployed throughout DOD in the 80s. It was found to be very successful. It allowed military organizations to learn from one operation and apply it immediately to the next. It was so successful, in fact, that other organizations, large government agencies, and commercial organizations adopted it. And now it's being used by almost everybody. So Department of Justice, Department of Energy, Homeland Security, FEMA, and the list kind of goes on and on with regards to who's using the after-action review process. I want to talk about a couple of the concepts that were part of the original plan for after-action reviews. The first one was that it was designed to simply leverage what was learned in the current operation for the next operation. That was it. Just learn and get better for the next operation. It was designed to be scalable so that it would work for both small operations up to very, very large operations. So you could use the same process for improving after any range of operation. The next point that was important, and this is probably the most important, is it was strictly focused on learning and improving. The AAR was not designed to be a critique or a performance rating or some sort of evaluation or an investigation. It's simply learning what we did well and what we did poorly so we can do better next time. That's all it was about. And then the final thing is it was designed to be a process, not a report. And it was a process to identify what you can improve and then to make those changes. And in some cases, that information was captured in a formal report. So within DOE, we're governed by DOE Order 151.1D. And DOE, and the order makes 5 references to after-action reviews. And I've quoted one of them here. And you can see it says, conduct an after-action review of the emergency operations system when it is activated for an actual incident. And it goes on to say, if it was activated for an operational emergency, document the performance review in an after-action report. So this is one of the points that it makes in the DOE order, that we have to do an after-action review if we activate. It goes on to talk about that if you do generate an after-action report, it must be submitted to the field element manager, and it must be submitted within 45 days, and you must develop a corrective action plan within 45 days of completing the AAR report. So the order does not specify a lot of details for AARs, and I think this is great because it gives each organization and entity the ability to specify how they're going to do their AARs. At Lawrence Livermore, we have a document that says, all right, for emergency management, this is how we conduct AARs here at Lawrence Livermore. And that provides some of the detail and specification on the approach that'll be used for conducting an AAR. And to some extent, this presentation is giving you how Lawrence Livermore is conducting AARs. All right, so let's talk about the scope of an AAR, what's in and what's not in an AAR. The most important thing that's in an AAR is identification of what went well and what went poorly. And the reason it identifies what went well is so that those techniques can be reinforced and promoted and used again in the next emergency. The reason it focuses on what went poorly is so that a better way can be found for the next emergency. Now, in addition to what went well and what went poorly, it also identifies certain sort of factual information. What happened, what was the timeline. Usually includes certain number of lists. These are the notifications that went out. These were the number of people that responded or things like that. But the most important part is not the factual stuff, but rather the analysis of what went well and what went poorly. Now, as I mentioned, an AAR is, it's not a rating. It's not a performance rating of any sort. It's also not just identifying the facts. We don't want it to be just a list of information and that the reader has to kind of go out and read it and sort of draw out what went well and what went poorly. And it also does not determine corrective actions or solutions. That effort takes place after the after-action review. And that's fairly important because the understanding of an issue will change as the AAR unfolds. And so you want to get everything on the table, understand everything that went well and went poorly, and then start determining solutions. Also, you may not have all the right people in an AAR meeting to determine the best solution. So solutions happen after the AAR. And then finally, it's not an accident or an occurrence investigation. That may happen in parallel. If the emergency was caused by an accident, there may be an accident investigation going on. But that's a separate activity that's focused on understanding root cause and very tight timelines and so forth. Whereas the AAR is trying to understand, what went well, what went poorly, to learn and improve for the next emergency. So I'm going to go over several considerations. You can see them here: when to conduct it, what level, and so forth. When you have to conduct an AAR, these are some of the things that you need to consider. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. First, when is the best time to conduct it? If you are doing a drill or an exercise or something that's scheduled, then that's fairly easy. You just schedule it for right afterwards, and you can conduct the AAR right away, and it'll all be fresh in people's minds. If it's a real emergency, it's a little bit harder. If it's a short emergency, you can still sort of do it when it's all over because the emergency didn't go on for too long, and it still will be fresh in people's minds. If it's a really long-running emergency, and I'm thinking COVID, right? We all just went through that. You really can't wait until it's completely over because people will have forgotten what happened in the early stages. What we did at the lab at Lawrence Livermore for COVID is we started the AAR probably four months after the pandemic started. And at that point, things had stabilized enough that we could take people's time and talk to them about what went well, what went poorly, and start putting together the after-action review. All right, one of the things I'll mention about when you do it is AARs also serve as a sort of form of closure for the responders. If they had to manage emergency for a couple of weeks and then the recovery for a couple of weeks, the AAR is a good way to sort of bring closure to all that. Everybody talks about it, what went well, what went poorly. You kind of wrap it up, and an AAR can serve as a means to provide closure to the incident. All right, the next thing to consider is what level of AAR is appropriate. What level do you want to do? And I really think that there's 3 levels. The first level is just an individual AAR, and that's people thinking about how they did personally, and usually it results in nothing more than just handwritten notes for themselves. The next level is an organizational AAR, and that's usually a department or an entity like the EOC. And this is the most common type of AAR. These happen all the time, and it studies how the organization did, what went well, what went poorly for that particular organization. And then the next level is institutional. And so if you have a large incident that affects many organizations, you'll benefit from doing an institutional AAR, where you consider across the whole institution, how did things go? All of these organizations. Institutional AARs are almost always documented in an AAR report. All right, another consideration is classification. And the key concern here is if you put classified information into an AAR, it greatly reduces the audience that can read it. And the objective is to learn and improve. And so we want to be able to have as many people as possible be able to read the AAR. So if you managed an incident that had classified concerns, one approach is to take and do a small AAR that's strictly classified, that has all the classified thoughts. The other one, and then do another one that addresses all of the other aspects, the ones that are non-classified, which will be most of them. And that can be a much larger after-action review. It can involve more people. The report can be distributed further. And so that's one way to deal with it. But ideally, you can keep classified information out of an AAR so that you can share the AAR to the extent possible to maximize learning. Oh, and the last point on this slide is an AAR should not include any personally identifiable information, and that's for the same reason. You are going to greatly narrow the audience if you put any PII in your AAR. If you discuss PII in the AAR review, or if you put it into the report. All right, the next consideration is the audience. What I mean by this is if, for example, an organization is doing an AAR just for their organization, they can go into great detail about their internal operations and what went well and what went poorly and what they could do different. But if that same organization is participating in an AAR that is going to be institutional wide, they have to sort of tailor their thoughts to be more, how did we interact with other organizations? What was our impact to the rest of the institution? Because the rest of the institution won't really benefit from really hardcore analysis of the internal operations of that organization. And in a lot of cases, if you are doing an institutional after-action review, you'll have organizations that do their own internal one. And so they should be focused, on the detail for their own internal one and the broader picture for the institutional one. All right, next, let's see. The next consideration when you're going to do an AAR is who's going to do it. I kind of recognize three roles. These roles can be combined if you're doing a small AAR into a single person. One role is the author. Who's going to end up writing the AAR report? And ideally, you'll have a single person that does the entire report, right? That way it has just a single voice, and that's better than having sections of the report written by different organizations and then merging them together. So the author's role, write the report, and also usually to write certain other, field notes and other things. The second role is the team leader. If you're doing a big AAR, like an institutional AAR, you're going to have lots of organizations, lots of issues, lots of coordination, reconciling things. And it's good to have somebody that can take charge of all that, because if it is an institutional AAR, it's going to be big and the author's going to be busy writing. And so by having the team leader take over all the coordination and running the meetings and everything else helps the author be focused on the writing. And then the last role is that of management. In my opinion, management's role is predominantly to say, this is important. If somebody says, why are we doing this? And so they kind of serve as a management champion to make sure that the people that participated take the time to think through what went well and what went poorly, and it all gets captured so that we can maximize our improvement. If you're doing an organizational AAR, management is usually the management of the organization. If you're doing an institutional one, it should be institutional management. It should be the management champion. Next thing to think about when you're going to do an after action review is what are you going to consider? And so I put a couple of items on the right here as examples. But the key thing about this is that every incident is different, and therefore every AAR is different. And so you can't really have a fixed list that you will always do for every AAR. You don't want to spend time focusing on categories of analysis that were really not relevant for this emergency, right? If there was no fire as a part of the incident, you don't really need to go into the fire response component, right? And so what I normally do is I create a list at the beginning and say, all right, these are the things that I think were important. Make sure you share it and get everybody's buy-in saying, yep, that's the things we need to look at. And then use that as your start point. It will evolve as you have your AAR meetings and talk about things. Other issues will come up, other considerations, and this list will evolve. When you're thinking about what organizations to include in an AAR, personally, I like to sort of cast a very broad net. Anybody that might have served some role, performed some activity, have some perspective that might improve our performance, I want to make sure they get to participate in the AAR and share their perspective. So I tend to come up with a pretty big list. Now, those are the ones that are invited. They may not all participate, but there's also another set of organizations that have to participate just by virtue of the importance of what they did during the response. And so you need to identify those organizations, coordinate with them to make sure that they're going to be there, because you need to have them, right? If it was a security related incident, you really need the security organization's perspective, right? They got to participate. Okay. Next. All right, so all of this information that I listed about thinking about how to do an after-action review, if you're doing a big AAR, you may want to put it into a document. That's what we did for COVID. It was 2 or 3 page, maybe 3 or 4 page document that listed all these things, the organizations that'll participate, what level of AAR, that there's no classified information in there, the statutory requirements and so forth. And then that was distributed to get people on board saying, all right, here's the plan. This is what we're going to do for our AAR. And then when people agreed, then we were ready to start the AAR. We don't do AAR plans very often because it's really only needed for a very large AAR. All right, so when you start your AAR, one of the things you're going to spend a lot of your time doing is conducting meetings. And that's entirely appropriate because a meeting is an excellent way to gather information. The AAR meetings essentially serve as sort of brainstorming sessions where people can talk about what went well and what went poorly and try to bounce ideas off of each other and kind of reconcile things and zero in on what's important. And so there'll be a lot of meetings. And you can kind of schedule them whatever works best for this particular incident. You could do it by organization. You can do it by subject area or chronology. We had during COVID, and I'm using that as an example because that's an incident that all of us have recently experienced. We had one of our organizations was the EOC. Another organization was the whole planning phase, which is the planning team. And we just kind of created what was necessary, the meetings that were necessary to make sure we covered all the important parts of dealing with COVID so that we can gather all the perspectives. It is likely that some individuals will have to participate in multiple meetings. So for example, the people that were managing facilities, they clearly had to participate in the facility AAR meeting because we were talking about the impact of COVID on the facilities and what went well and what went poorly. But the main person for facilities also was in the EOC for the first several weeks. So they participated in the EOC AAR meetings as well. And there's really not a lot of overlap there. One meeting we talked strictly about facility stuff, and the other meeting we talked about EOC stuff. And so people will have to attend multiple meetings, the ones that played multiple roles. The last consideration for scheduling the meetings is try to keep them to a good size. I try to shoot for between 5 and 10 people in the meeting, because if you have a huge meeting, 70 people in the meeting, then there's a certain percentage of the people that are not going to speak up because they don't want to talk in front of 70 people. But 5 to 10 people is small enough that pretty much everybody's willing to share their perspective. But it's also big enough that you can have a little bit of brainstorming, a little bit of back and forth. I have definitely done a lot of one-on-one AAR meetings, gathering one person's perspective. And if you have to, that's fine. But ideally, there's a couple of other people because then you get much better discussion. All right, so when you're doing your AAR meetings, one of the things that I have found is that the way you start them is critical. We as emergency managers have done a lot of AARs. We're very familiar with it. If you're doing a very large institutional AAR, you're going to have organizations that have never done one and are not sure exactly what this is all about and might be a little concerned. And so I normally started off by saying, the only thing I'm interested in is what went well and what went poorly. I don't really care who did what. I'm not trying to, fix blame or assess performance or anything like that. I just want to know what went well for you and what went poorly so that we can, be better for the next emergency. The other thing I tell them is that I'm gonna make a list of the things you give me, and I'm gonna send you that list, and I'm gonna ask you to proofread it carefully, and to make sure it reflects your perspective. And that gives them assurance that they're going to have sort of the final say on their input and that you're not going to misunderstand or misinterpret something they say. And so that usually causes them to relax and be comfortable with sharing what went well and what went poorly. I then give them instructions about, don't include anything classified, no classified discussions, and also no personally identifiable information. And then I turn the meeting over to the participants by asking a very open-ended question. I might ask, so how'd it go? Or what went well, what went poorly? And just normally what happens at that time is silence, to be honest. 15 seconds of silence, typically, for people that are not used to AARs. But you let the silence do its work, and eventually somebody will speak. A lot of the times it's sort of the manager of the group. And they will say something, and then a little more silence, and somebody else will reply, and then somebody else will reply. And 10 minutes later, they're talking so fast that you cannot keep up. And that's just typically how these things go. And so one of the things you have to do is you have to, when you're conducting the AAR meeting, is you have to avoid talking too much because you have to let them talk, right? And as an emergency manager, you probably understand emergencies better than anybody else in the room. And you don't want to give them their perspective. You want them to give you their perspective. And so don't talk too much, let them do the talking. And the other thing you have to do is you have to remain objective. I played an important role with regards to doing the AAR for COVID at Lawrence Livermore, and I went into it pretty much understanding all the issues. And as it unfolded, many issues, a dozen or more, it turns out I completely misunderstood the big picture. And if I had been sort of fixed on what I felt was the issues at the beginning, I wouldn't have been open-minded enough to realize, oh, wow, okay, I was wrong about that. That's not the cause, it's this. And this is, I thought this went well, but actually in reality, it wasn't that good. So be open-minded, be objective when you're conducting these meetings, and try not to talk too much so that you gather their perspective. So during meetings, it's quite possible that issues come up that people don't agree on, and that's completely okay. And it's completely fine to capture that as an issue and to ultimately put it into an AAR report, right? Say, for example, one organization thinks they should have done an activity, and another organization thinks they should have, and they don't agree. Well, you've identified an issue, right? Two organizations think they should be doing that activity, and there was confusion. So you can just capture that versus trying to get them to agree who should have done it. Just capture that there's uncertainty there, and that's creating confusion, and we need to figure it out during the corrective action phase. All right. Now, the other thing that happens a lot during after action review meetings, particularly for people that don't do them all the time, is they give you solution-oriented issues, right? So I provide an example here on the slide. Somebody will say, we should have used a spreadsheet to keep track of supplies. Well, that's a solution-oriented issue, right? Because, you know, a spreadsheet is one solution, right? If you look at the next bullet, you know, we had trouble keeping track of supplies. That's not solution-oriented, right? Because maybe the organization has an application that's perfect for this and it's already ready to go and they just could have used it. Maybe they shouldn't have used a spreadsheet. We don't know what the right solution is, and we don't want to try to figure out during an after action review, right? So we also don't want to sort of bias the issue by having it being solution oriented. So, you know, what I found myself doing is people were raising things, at least half the issues raised were solution oriented. And as I wrote them down to put it into the document that I was going to send them for them to review, I translated it to be non-solution oriented. And I sent them, you know, in the document, non-solution oriented issues, and they reviewed that. So the second bullet is referring to, this doesn't happen often, but when it does, you need to know what to do. If the emergency resulted in a loss of life, significant injuries, conducting the AAR meeting is basically forcing people to sort of revisit or relive what happened to identify what went well and what went poorly. This can create trauma for people that are impacted by the loss of life and the injuries. If that happens, just conclude the meeting. You don't need to try to work through that. Just conclude the meeting saying, all right, we're good for now. And try to find the information you need through other ways, but also make sure that that individual knows, you know, that there's professional resources available for helping them deal with the trauma they're feeling as a result of the emergency. So if that comes up, and it happens rarely, that's how I would deal with it, is just simply conclude the meeting and make sure the person knows they have help. All right, so next. So as I mentioned, the way I document an AAR meeting is simply to write down what went well and what went poorly. I'm not taking minutes. I'm not saying, you know, Joe said this, and then Jill responded with that, and then Sue said this. That's more detail than we need. All we need to know is what went well and what went poorly from this organization's perspective. And I'm writing it in a solution-independent way. I try to write it up right after the meeting or as soon as I can so I don't forget it. And then I send it to them. And I ask them to review it carefully. And they, in general, they make a lot of changes. Because you had this meeting and you got them thinking, and now after the meeting, they continued to think about it. They continued to talk about it. So it was very frequent that when I sent out this minute, they said, well, we thought of 2 other things. Can we add them? And then, you know, they would send me some text that was solution oriented, and I would translate it to be not solution oriented and repeat it back to them. And we'd go back and forth a little bit, but eventually we'd end up with a 1-page or 2-page document that listed from that organization's perspective, this went well and this went poorly. And that serves as raw input to the big after action review report. So let's talk about the report. The main thing with the AAR report is that it should be readable. Because you want as many people as possible to read it and benefit from the information that's in there. And so the person that's writing it is typically an emergency manager, and they're very knowledgeable of emergency management, but a lot of the readers won't be. And so you want to avoid using emergency management speak and try to use plain English to the extent possible in the document. We also should avoid jargon. We don't want to say hot wash, we conducted a hot wash. We want to say we conducted an after action review, because hot wash is a form of jargon. I recommend summaries because the AARs are something that you go back to and refer back to. And you don't want to have to reread all of the text to identify what the major things were. You want to see a summary that says, all right, and in summary, these are all the things that went well and these are all the things that went poorly. And then a couple of my personal things is I try to avoid long sentences. I also avoid parentheses unless they're defining an acronym, because parentheses usually reflect an incomplete thought, and that doesn't really belong in a formal report. And I also avoid slashes, because slashes, depending on the interpretation, can be either an or an and so it creates confusion, and I don't want that uncertainty in the document, so I avoid slashes as well. The AAR report should have a neutral tone. You should describe something that went well with the same tone as you describe something that went poorly, because we're not passing judgment. We're not assigning blame or anything like that. We want it to be very neutral, and we don't want people to be defensive when they read it. So try not to word things really, really strongly when it's negative, and just try to keep a neutral tone throughout the whole thing. Focus on the analysis, right? So you conducted all these AAR meetings, and you have all these different inputs from these different organizations that needs to be analyzed. And because there's going to be duplication across there, there's going to be conflict between issues that are raised. It needs to be analyzed, and the AAR report should include that analysis. That's the most valuable part. And it shouldn't just be a litany, as I mentioned before, just a long list of all the things that happened. So try to focus on the analysis, and that'll make the report as valuable as possible. All right, when you're reviewing the report, I usually do it in three phases, and this is only for really large AARs. As I mentioned, the first phase is simply having each organization review their own input. The second phase is putting all of the organizational inputs together and having them look at that. And the purpose of that phase is not so that they can argue with other organizations and disagree with them, but rather so that it broadens each organization's perspective and they start to see the big picture. And, they thought this went really well, but another department, it was really a nightmare for them. So it sort of broadens their perspective that, oh, okay. So then they'll understand when the final AAR report of analysis, it says that it's unclear if this was a benefit or not, because it really hurt that organization, but helped this organization. So that's why I have them review all of the inputs. And then the final thing is reviewing the AAR report and looking at the analysis. When you finally have an AAR report, it has to be published, and there's really two parts to that. The first one is formal submittals. As I mentioned at the beginning, the order requires us to submit AAR's reports to the field element manager within 45 days. So that's a form of formal submittal. So that needs to happen. But beyond that, there's another group, which is sort of the interested parties. And I think that anybody that participated, even a little bit in organizations, should receive a copy of the final report. And so that's important, is to make sure that you get it out to those other interested parties. The final consideration here is there's retention requirements for the AAR report. And I didn't list the specifics because I'm not sure we all have the same retention requirements, but make sure you understand the retention requirements for your AAR report so that you can adhere to them. All right, so in conclusion, the AAR process is sort of a really critical tool for us to use to get better from emergency to emergency to emergency. The DOE Order does establish some of the requirements for us, but they leave a lot of the details for us to determine. And I think that's great. And the purpose of this presentation was to provide an overview of some approaches, the approaches that we use with regards to conducting AARs. And hopefully some of that information has been useful and may provide some ideas for your own AAR processes. And then the final comment I'll make is that if you want to talk about AARs or have an issue, concern or something you want to try, don't hesitate to contact me. I'd love to talk with you. So with that, I think we can turn it back over for questions and answers.
Thank you for that presentation, Jim. We did have one question, but before I get to that, there was a comment, kind of reminds me of Facebook when you like a post. And the comment was, completing an AAR provides closure for responders. And the person said, I really like this and hadn't thought about that. So thank you. The question was, what is the greatest challenge of preparing an AAR during a pandemic?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind would be the difficulty in getting people together. Obviously, with the pandemic, we couldn't put everybody in the same room. But, in thinking about it, I'm not sure that's the hardest thing, because people were pretty comfortable with brainstorming via WebEx and so on. I think probably the biggest challenge was actually it was a slow-moving, long-running incident. And so the question was, when do you do the AAR? We activated our EOC March 5th, and we kept thinking it would get better, and then we can do the AAR when it was over, and then it would get worse. And I can remember hitting May saying, all right, well, when are we going to do the AAR? Because we don't want people to forget what happened 2 months ago. So we ended up starting the AAR, even though things were still going pretty poorly. And we've kind of kept the AAR open, and particularly the review part of it, so that as new things happened, people would review the AAR and make sure that it's still relevant and still captured everything that went well and went poorly. I think we even got to the point where we were doing vaccinations and we're able to roll that in. By that point, everybody had contributed and everybody had reviewed, but we were able to continue to refine it. So that was probably the biggest challenge. When do we start? And we ultimately decided to start reasonably quickly and then kind of do the AAR slowly over time so we can capture as much as possible of the recovery.
Thank you for that. So is it more like a lessons learned ongoing rather than an AAR? I mean, when do you close it out? Or do we close it out and start over?
Eventually you have to close it out. Eventually you have to publish it and say, that's it.
Okay.
But as the technique that we used, I think it worked well for us. We were able to capture everything that happened early and then get everybody's thoughts. And then we kind of kept it open for a while to capture anything new that happened as the incident continued to unfold. It worked well for us.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Great start to our morning, Jim. I do want to remind everybody that this presentation has been recorded and it should be available within 12 to 24 hours. And for all of you that have attended, a little over 60 people, wonderful attendance. Don't forget to fill out your survey so that you get credit for this attendance. And again, tonight at 4 p.m. Mountain Time, we will have a scavenger hunt during the social hour. So these are all items you should be able to find at home, probably more readily than you would have had you not been at home for the last 18 months. Again, thank you so much, Jim, for your presentation. We look forward to seeing you again.